I find it equally interesting to ask newcomers to the American West, as well as Westerners who have returned to the region after a time away, what about the region drew them here or drew them back? Often it's simply pragmatic issues like a job. But if they're here because they felt drawn to it, because they consciously or subconsciously felt it would provide something unique that they lacked but needed, or because the region would somehow allow them to be or become a person that was impossible elsewhere, those reasons are truly fascinating. Welcome to Writing Westward. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. This month we speak with writer and professor Mark Sundeen about his new essay collection, Delusions and Grandeur, Dreamers of the New West. Through his own life and the Western characters he's met and profiled over the years, Sundeen narrates aspirations that people project on the West, as well as the realities they find. These are moving and powerful stories that will make you think. Thanks for listening. For new listeners, here's a brief introduction to the podcast and myself. Writing Westward is a monthly podcast featuring conversations with historians, journalists, scientists, and scholars from various disciplines who are writing about the North American West. The goal of these exchanges is to spark your curiosity to think more deeply about the region, its lands and environments, and the histories and experiences of the peoples who have called it home. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University, where I, Brendan Rensink, serve as Associate Director and I'm a Professor of History. For better or worse, this is a one-man operation. I am the host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, all roles for which I have zero training. But I am passionate about the North American West, and I'll take any excuse to read more and talk to interesting people who are writing about the region. If a guest intrigues you, you can find links to their work in the show notes or at writingwestward.org. If you have a moment, please subscribe and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Share links with friends and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X, Twitter, and send in some feedback. At the end of the episode, I will include some more information about my own scholarship and the Redd Center, our programming and projects, and funding opportunities that you could apply for. That's right, we may want to give you money. And with that, let me introduce who we are talking to this month and why. Mark Sundeen is a novelist, essayist, and associate professor of environmental studies at the University of Montana. You can find information about him at his website, marksundeen.com. Before accepting his current position in Missoula, he held the Russo Chair in Creative Writing at the University of New Mexico and was a visiting writer at the University of Utah's Environmental Humanities program, as well as other positions in previous locations. He holds a bachelor's in English from Stanford University and a master's in professional writing from the University of Southern California. He has written articles for the New York Times Magazine, Outside Magazine, National Geographic Adventure, McSweeney's, and other outlets, and is the author of 5 books. Car Camping, The Book of Desert Adventures, The Making of Toro, Bullfights, Broken Hearts, and One Author's Quest for the Acclaim He Deserves. The Man Who Quit Money, The Unsettlers, In Search of the Good Life in Today's America, and the book we speak about today, published by the University of New Mexico Press just this year in 2025, Delusions and Grandeur, Dreamers of the New West. In Delusions and Grandeur, Sundeen has collected a number of essays published in magazines over the past 25 years, as well as some new unpublished pieces. Together, they all profile Western characters, including Sundeen himself, and explores the ways in which their hopes and dreams in the region intersect with the on-the-ground realities and developments. By pulling back the curtain on various prototypical Western activities, locations, industries, and philosophies, Sundeen muddies the waters in the best of ways. Everything is a little more complicated than what appears at the surface level. Even those characters who seem to be living out a supposedly, quote-unquote, authentic Western life are revealed to be operating within systems that erode the foundations of the very authenticity that they seek. Taken together, these essays will change the way you view the peoples, societies, and cultures that call these Western landscapes home. And by so removing some of the blinders that restrict our view, or the rose-tinted lenses that color it, Sundeen's stories might help us see ourselves and those around us in the West more clearly and more honestly. Mark Sundeen, welcome to Writing Westward.
Thanks for having me.
I hope that things are going well for you up in Missoula. I know that after years more down in the desert Southwest, this may be a little cooler than you're used to.
This is the time of year where I really start to miss southern Utah. I mean, I think November's my favorite month down there, and my least favorite in Montana when it gets really cold, but there's no snow yet.
So nothing
Kind
to
of
go play in yet?
a brown cold wasteland is starting tomorrow. Yeah.
Nothing we can do about that, unfortunately. Um, I'm really excited to talk about this essay collection of yours. Often, a lot of my interviews with people are talking about just history books. And so I always like when we have chances to talk with authors that are, like creative nonfiction, and especially books where the author is in the book themselves is a lot. So it makes it for fun reading and for a fun conversation. I wanted to start by actually, I mean, just kind of like in your introduction, you start this volume by kind of ruminating a bit on the dreamers, the drifters, pilgrims, I think hucksters is a line you use, who kind of seek to remake themselves. And in the West, and the West seems to attract these kinds of people. And you include yourself in that tradition. I think you use the phrase extreme escapists, and that the West serves as some playground or a space where people can go and escape and become something or whatnot. Can you give us a little bit about your background and your move from Southern California, where you grew up, to Moab, Utah, in the early '90s? What was 1993 Mark looking for in the West? And what did he
Yeah.
find?
Well, I grew up in LA, and I think if you look at the history of the West, that was where all of the grifters and drifters and swamis and gurus and hucksters and conmen all ended up in like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, maybe into the 60s. And then by the time I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, it had basically become a huge cosmopolitan city. It had Hollywood, it had one of the wealthiest places in the world. And those people were no longer really there in the huge numbers, just largely because it was too expensive and too settled. And I think there was kind of a boomerang effect where people bounced off the coast, uh, and they ended up in the Intermountain West and in the Southwest deserts. Uh, and I guess you might say I was one of them. I was a California refugee, largely because I looked into the my crystal ball and saw that I was never going to be able to afford to live in the parts of California that I had grown up in and I loved. And so uh, I headed out to become a river guide. And like so many people who ended up in Moab, Utah, there's sort of an origin story that depicts the kind of randomness and maybe the feeling of you didn't choose it, it chose you. And in my case, that was I'd flunked out of a river guide training school in Colorado, and then I picked up two hitchhikers, and they wanted to go to Moab, and I wanted to go somewhere else, so I dropped them off. The place I wanted to go, the road was closed because of a mudslide, so I turned around. This is up by Fruita, Colorado, and they were still sitting there. They were college students from Colorado College, and so I picked them up, and we went down to Moab, and I dropped them off. I never saw them again, and I stayed for 11 years.
Never saw him around town again?
No, I think they might have just stayed for a day or two and left.
Well, maybe they'll see the book and recognize themselves in the story.
Yeah.
So, like, did you have an idea in your head of like why river running in Colorado or Utah? Like, why this kind of wild existence, or the very kind of wild experience in the West? What drew you to that?
Well, I think I'd often felt that growing up in LA, things were just a little too suburban and socially stratified and uh, made out of concrete. So I got really into rock climbing in high school, and I would go out to Joshua Tree and Yosemite Valley and Talkeets, places like that. So I was pretty into the outdoors. And then later on, like so many of us, I read some Edward Abbey, and I found out there was places you could go down a river for 85 miles and not see a road or a car, and that just sounded so alluring to me. So that was why I decided to become a river guide. And But once I got to Moab, much to my surprise, I found this incredible community of um, weirdos, artists, some thinkers, builders, off-gridders, uh, backcountry rangers, people who were farming, people who were rock climbing, people who were trying to invent new ways of living. And, I mean, I guess the ironic part is I'd come from San Francisco, where a lot of college graduates like myself thought that they could have the writer's life that they maybe dreamed about, thinking about Paris in the 1920s or Greenwich Village in the 1940s, or San Francisco maybe in the 60s. But of course, that was all done, and it was just expensive. And it's hard to be an artist when you have to spend that much money on rent. And so when I got to Moab, unintentionally, I found that place where I could be a writer, because I could work as a river guide for 5 months out of the year. And then for a lot of the rest of the year, I didn't have to work because I was paying $150 a month in rent to live in Moab. And, Moab at that time was still recovering from the bust of the uranium mill and mine. And guides I knew who'd been there 6 years earlier had literally walked into houses that the miners had abandoned, and they just started paying the monthly payment, no money down, and they just got a house, on a river guide's salary. So it was this beautiful moment where what has now become recognized as one of the most beautiful places in the world was like dirt cheap to live. It was not gentrified. It was not that touristy. And but all these fascinating, interesting, like inspiring people were finding their way there and building this really cool community that allowed me to be the writer that I'd wanted to be.
I mean, we can kind of get to how Moab has turned into something very different, where if someone goes down there with that idea now,
They'll be sad.
I mean, you write in the book about various ways in which you did have some kind of rude awakenings, in which the ideas you had of what life was going to be there maybe were a little more complicated. I think people are going to meet those rude awakenings a lot faster nowadays, in a lot of places in the West that have become, with the kind of the devil's bargain of tourism development. But you got in kind of at that last era, maybe of being able to not dirtbag it completely, but kind of in that world.
Oh yeah, I mean, I remember I was living in my car right in town, and that was legal back then, and just kind of camped out at a like a park basically in town. And I still have my trailer in Moab, and I know people who are just moving there, and the dirtbags are like literally camping 25 miles out of town and commuting into town to work their job, which is crazy. It's like suburban dirtbagging, right? You gotta keep moving out into the outer ring camping areas where it's still free. But yeah, it's really heartbreaking to see what's happened in Moab, and to see that I don't know, I think they have maybe 30,000, 40,000 tourists come in there most popular weekends, in a town that only has about 10,000 of regular year-round residents. And I mean, of course, like getting back to Ed Abbey, like the person who has been the most avid defender or proponent of that place is probably the man singly most responsible for its demise, and that he wrote these books that everyone read and said, wow, I want to see this desert where I'm all by myself. I want to be the only person out there. And that takes a lot of acres for every tourist to get out there and be by themselves. And like, I remember being so inspired by Abbey and this idea that, the desert wasn't just a place for resource extraction. It wasn't a wasteland. It was this place of absolute beauty and like almost aesthetic and spiritual contemplation. And I said, yeah. And when I got there, it was still like that. But it's impossible for 40,000 people in one county to all have that experience at the same time. And so I just read a story, saying one of those things where someone went to every national park, and when they wrote about arches in Canyonlands, all they talked about was how crowded they were. Like, there was no talk about, like, the sort of desert solitaire feeling of beauty.
I mean, I've been here for 10, 11 years, and, we take our kids down there and whatnot, and even in the last decade, I've seen this change. But this, I mean, there is some irony in that Abby was promoting, this kind of experience of solitude. But, as we find out, that experience is a commodity itself. Like, we're extracting a specific,
Right.
it's not an extractive resource in terms of minerals, but it's an extractive industry in the sense of, like, we're extracting a specific experience. And there's it's a finite resource. If it gets too
Right.
crowded, you just can't have that experience anymore.
Well, and the real irony is that sometimes that industry of solitude tourism is actually more damaging or disrupting than some of the old industries, like drilling for oil or running cattle, because in the 90s, like, you'd go out by yourself and you might see some cows, or you might see some oil rigs, and maybe they were abandoned, but, like, that felt more aesthetically pleasing than going out and seeing 67 people with their camelbacks and their $7,000 mountain bikes and whatnot.
Yeah, and their selfie sticks to, get that gram, at that one
Yeah,
overlook, and there's a line of everyone with getting their picture of themselves on the edge of a cliff with no one else in sight,
right.
but that there's 100 people standing behind them, right?
Yeah, and, like, Ed Abbey's big thing was, like, get the cows off of public land. And, looking back, that maybe wasn't such a great idea, because it's the sort of cows versus condos debate. Like, the
Yeah.
cows ultimately are less damaging than the tourists. So I don't know. It's a conundrum.
One other thing I wanted to mention from the introduction, and we'll actually get into, like, some of the stories from the rest of the book, but at the very first paragraph, you quote your wife. You don't quote, I guess you're paraphrasing her. But this is
Right.
a phrase I might start opening some lectures that I teach with this phrase. This is, like, just really unbelievable. So she writes, or you write, paraphrasing her, that the colonized West is the teenager of America, all beauty and body, prone to outbursts, boom and bust, brain not fully formed, driven by passionate beliefs about the self that later turned to be dubious. Oh my goodness, that's um, I mean, I don't know if you remember the exact conversation that's prompted that, but what was the context in which that came out, and talking about the West and the kinds of experiences people have out here?
Well, my wife Cedar, she is a poet, so that kind of thing just
Flows out
uh,
of her.
kind of flows out of her. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And also, she, as I say in the book, she was raised in Whitefish, which is a town that has a lot of similarities to Moab and other resort towns. That, that when she grew up, it was still kind of a logging town that had a little ski hill, and now the little ski hill has become a huge resort, and the logging industry is done, basically. And it's, the houses are $800,000. Um, and so we talk about these kind of things a lot, and she's very heartbroken about what happened to her hometown in Whitefish. Um, but no, this idea that we have these passionate beliefs that in retrospect don't always seem that great, and I feel that way about I mean, this kind of relates to what we were just talking about. Like, in the 90s, I think those of us who were working I was working as a river guide. Those of us who worked outside were just like, we gotta shut down all this polluting industry, and we did not imagine that we were going to create this other polluting industry. That's a different type of pollution, but it's hard to say that it's a better industry.
I mean, this is one of the through lines through a lot of these essays is these paradoxes, these incongruities between expectation and reality, I mean, the title, like, they're delusions, often, or that they prove to
Right.
be in the long run, right?
And I would just add, just for balance, like, it's true that I think some of the environmentalists and the lefties were deluded in thinking that tourism was going to be better than mining, and maybe deluded in thinking that aesthetic contemplation was a more important value than resource extraction. And on the other hand, I think the miners and the industry people who thought that, and the ranchers who thought that ranching in the desert was sustainable, they were also deluded. And as were the people who thought that they could just dump millions of tons of uranium tailings by the side of the Colorado River, and that would be fine. Like, delusion.
This is maybe one of the big questions that we'll never answer, but that's interesting to think about these kinds of Western land, not just the West, but like, the remote West, which we find in mountains or in these desert areas. I think there's something about these landscapes that make them prone for us to be projecting delusional ideas on them in ways that, I think other regions, even other regions in the West, maybe don't attract quite as much. I mean, you see these wide open spaces and you think like, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
limitless possibilities, and it just inspires all kinds of delusional thinking.
You don't hear about people taking a road trip to Cincinnati or St. Louis or Kansas City and just saying like, "Wow, the land has never spoke to me this way. I've never felt so caressed and embraced by the planet. I'm just gonna stay here until I figure something out." Um, that pretty much only happens in the West. I mean, maybe it
Yeah.
happens in Maine and the Florida Keys as well, but for the most part, that connection you can feel with the non-human world here is profound. I mean, and it absolutely does, ins I think, inspire, yeah, your own sort of feelings of like having like an oversoul, and having sort of like an immortal soul, and feeling like there is a connection with the non-human that is spiritual. And that's like incredibly powerful, and makes you think you can do anything.
Well, this paradox is something that I guess we've already unpacked quite a bit, but I think it's worth emphasizing again how throughout a lot of these essays, you address this reality that people coming here to live a certain very specific kind of Western life, often idealized, but wrapped up in these identities of rugged individualism and so forth. But in so doing, they end up contributing to the very activities or economies or things that, maybe 10 years early when they arrived, they would have been screaming about as like, that's so inauthentic. Like, that's not what I'm here for. And then 20
Right.
years later, they look back and they've not, maybe bought into the system isn't the right phrase, but they're a part of it.
Yeah, I write about this in the introduction that, I was actually less interested in the product of authenticity and solitude that was being sold, and more interested in the people working behind the scenes, and the guide shops and the restaurants and the gas stations and the shuttle services to actually make it possible. And that's, of course, because I worked in that industry for 11 years. But it's a show in a lot of ways. It's a show that the industry puts on to let people have this feeling that they've read about in an Ed Abbey book.
So your essays kind of do peel back the curtain a little bit, and we see a lot of behind the scenes of, oh, this is what's actually going on there. That there's so much more behind
Yeah.
the scenes.
Yeah, and actually my first book, Car Camping, which I wrote in my 20s when I was actually living this, probably even does more of that. I was really inspired by, like, Down and Out in Paris and Rome, the George Orwell book of being what we would now call a dirtbag dishwasher in Paris and Rome in the 20s. But yeah, it was just like the very much behind the curtain of the tourist industry. And this new book, um, it takes maybe a slightly more analytical approach to it, and a broader approach. But yeah, I'm absolutely interested in that. Um, that idea that that we've got this product and we want to sell it, but we need a bunch of hardworking people doing low-paying jobs in order to make it work.
So you wrote these essays over the course of, it's like about 25-ish years. I think one goes back to the late 90s. I'm curious about why now you decided to join them all together into a single volume. And we should note that some of them have been published in, magazines and in various places. But were there central questions or ideas that you were thinking about over these 25 years while writing these essays? And I'm sure there's a million others of unpublished ones that you didn't put in this volume. Or was it looking back at these things you had written, you then saw through lines that you didn't see as you were writing them?
It's the second one. I just had all of these essays, and I mean, I love doing magazine work, but I also love the idea of these essays having a permanent home on a, a library shelf or a bookshelf. And so I was like, oh, I really want to put these essays together. And it wasn't until I really started building the collection and working with an editor that I started to see these ideas we've been talking about. The other one, of course, is it's related, but it's this idea of masculinity. I mean, it was a surprise to me to look at my collection and realize that almost all the people I was profiling as a journalist were men, and a lot of these men were white and lived in the rural West, and they had sort of libertarian views, and they shared kind of a disappointment of the way America had turned out. It hadn't fulfilled its promise. And like I said, these went back 25 years. And so it was only now in the time of Trump that I started to realize, like, oh, this is like that movement, that the populist right-wing movement that changed America and brought Trump into power. And I don't know that these people I profiled would have become Trump supporters. I'm not in touch with them anymore. But it was a surprise to see these people who I had so much affection for, and who I thought their politics were pretty interesting, like feeling like maybe now they would be lumped together with the alt-right.
Because of this general sense of dissatisfaction, or I had dreams and they weren't delivered
Exactly.
like I was promised.
Exactly. Yeah, America was supposed to do X, Y, and Z, and it didn't. America was supposed to make me, get have a meaningful career or make me feel free, and it didn't. And you could quite easily say, well, it's time for these rural white men to get a taste of what people of color and women have been feeling for generations. I think that's true, but I also think it's worth examining what are the disappointments, what are the dreams that were dashed. I don't think it's as simple as like white men had to cede their power to people of color and women. I think there's also some really like valid criticisms of the way that capitalism did not serve its minions.
It served a few,
Right,
but
right.
a very,
But
very
not
select few,
not the guys
right?
that I was writing about.
So I've gone through these essays and I kind of tried to identify a few different themes that maybe we can see how many of these we can get through, but of how the Western landscape, what it was serving, what purpose it was serving. And the first is as a place of escape. And we've already talked about this a little bit, but I don't know if it's the first essay, but one of the early ones, and one of the most striking stories you tell here is that of Noah Pippin, this military vet who goes up into the Bob Marshall Wilderness, Montana, which is one of the more expansive wilderness areas in the lower 48. It's enormous, and goes missing. Can you tell us a little bit about, and again, we're going to be, oh my goodness, I have so many things I want to talk about. We're not going to get to even a fraction of them. But what's the thumbnail sketch of what happened to him, or who he was and why he went out there? And what's the story that
Yeah.
you traced there?
I mean, it's hard. This was an incredible, like, missing person story. This guy was due back to go to redeploy to Afghanistan. He'd already been on 3 combat tours in Iraq. Instead of returning to his base in California, he rented a car and drove to Montana and didn't tell anyone where he was going, and disappeared and was never seen again. And they kind of tracked his last steps through, phone calls he'd made and car rental records and this kind of thing. So that was incredibly suspenseful. But the more I started to talk to his family and his friends and his buddies from the Marine Corps, like he really fit this mold that I was just articulating about someone who just felt like some disappointment, like that America hadn't delivered. So, he'd joined the Marines and he'd served in Iraq, and then he'd come home and been a police officer in Los Angeles. And he was a very sort of deep thinking, philosophical guy. He, not so much in a academic setting, but in these online forums, he was, really into economics and philosophy, and and the meaning of life and religion and sort of honor. And none of it seemed sort of good enough for him, or none of it seemed meaningful to him. And as I dove into his life and his online comments, like I just became really empathetic with what he'd gone through. That going to war did not feel like going to war in 1944, where he'd come home feeling like a hero. He'd come home instead feeling like, what was the point of all that? And then also, like, he came home and then he was living in his car at one point and working at Lowe's in Southern California. And like, it's like, where's the reward? Where's the GI Bill? Where's the hero's welcome? Like, that didn't happen either.
There's some dark clues though, like with he closes all of his like social media accounts, he cancels credit. Like he
Right.
does lots of things which suggest that he was not planning on coming back. And maybe this is a divergence between maybe, your experience in coming out west and seeking something and his, like there does seem to be a little bit of a darkness there or a finality to when he goes off
Yeah,
on
and
hikes in the
also,
wilderness.
and also, this draw to whatever he did, it needed to happen in wilderness. Again, he didn't go to Denver to do this final trek. And by the way, I should say that the mystery has been resolved, but you have to refer to the afterword in the book. I wrote the essay before it was resolved, and I decided to leave it standing as it was. So I won't give any spoilers as to how this turned out.
Another theme which we've already touched on a bit is maybe the West as a place of where expectations and ambitions run aground on like, hard realities or unexpected developments, kind of this delusions idea. And you include yourself in this. One of the fun ones you write about this river rafting trip down the Owyhee River in Oregon, which for those who don't know, which is probably most people, because this is just this corner in Northeast Oregon that just nobody goes there. It's
Right.
a really empty, wild country, and this canyon is, I think, it's one of the deepest canyons in North America.
Yeah.
But you write about having these kind of wild ambitions about this amazing adventure you're going to have, and maybe the hubris of man
Right.
is evident here, and you're very quickly humbled. How do things go awry on this trip, and how does this maybe exemplify this thing that happens so often of people having ambitions and grand ideas and very different experiences in reality?
My river friends were all guides, so we all think we know what we're doing, and we don't need to be that cautious because we can handle anything. We've done it professionally. And in this particular case, we had there's two sections. There's the class 6 section, which requires a portage and then has some class 5 rapids, and then there's the class 3 section, which is a kind of a nice family float. And we had decided to do the easy float, and at the last minute, all of the wives and girlfriends dropped out of the trip, probably with good reason. And so we decided, well, we might as well go do this hard section instead. And so we went up and did that section, and it was so hot. I mean, it was 98 degrees the day we were driving and launching, and it was the middle of summer, and we couldn't imagine it being cold. And sure enough, the next day, once we got down to the Whitewater, it was a big storm came in, and it hailed and rained, and we were out there getting soaked in these freezing cold rapids. And Luckily, we were able to find a cave where we hunkered down for a couple days. But we hadn't even brought our warm clothes.
Yeah, because it had been so hot when you launched. You're like, oh, we don't need this gear, and you just leave it behind.
Right. We just took all the cold beer and didn't take any of the warm
Tents
jackets.
or warm jackets.
No,
Yeah,
nothing like that. Yeah.
I think you're right that one of your friends, like at one point, he's like, I'm wearing 6 cotton shirts because he hadn't brought
Right.
his like puffy jacket or whatever.
Yeah.
It's a great tale of kind of, classic like hubris and folly and, hilarity ensues. Thankfully you all made it out okay, right? I mean, there's a little bit of a similar moment in your essay about climbing in Yosemite, and you're on your way up with this multi-pitch thing and you're hauling all this gear and, this is a big deal. Like, this is grand ambition. And this is not just ambition, like you are doing it. Like,
Yeah, and I was only
you're
15 or
you're
16
amazing,
years old. Yeah, I was only
right?
16 years old at the time, I think. Yeah.
And so you have this idea about like this amazing thing you're doing and like no one could be greater. And then some free soloer just cruises by you without ropes. And like, so again, like
Yeah.
this idea of like your grand ambitions and realities being dashed or being brought down to the real world of like, oh, I'm not the greatest a Western
Yeah.
adventurer there's ever been.
And this wasn't just some random free soloer. This was like a guy that I had a poster of hanging on my wall as a teenager. Like, this is one of my heroes, this rock climber named John Backer, who had famously kind of invented free soloing. And, my friend and I were climbing. We were climbing at our limit, and we had backpacks and, water bottles and shoes for the descent and lunch and all this stuff, and then of course all the ropes and carabiners and gear. And this guy climbs up beside us wearing just like skimpy running shorts and no shirt
And a chalk
his
bag.
chalk bag. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he climbed right past us, and then he down climbed, and then he climbed back up, and then he down climbed, and we probably only made it about 30 or 40 feet in all this time. But it did feel like being in Olympus next to a god. It was
Yeah.
that beautiful.
But it makes you kind of recalibrate your understanding of what limits are. And you thought you were at your limits, but clearly that's not
Exactly. Yeah.
the limits. But in that same essay, you talk about another famous climber who then died there in Yosemite doing like the wingsuit.
Yeah, that was Dean Potter.
So maybe he went beyond, like Icarus or something, like he went beyond some limits.
And John Backer also died free soloing many years after I saw him on that day. Yeah, and that essay, they did go beyond their limits, and I wrote that in reaction to, there was a kind of a round of armchair harumphing and scolding after Dean Potter died. Well, like,
how could he be so reckless? Blah, blah,
how
blah,
dare
blah,
he?
blah.
Yeah. And I just didn't believe that. I thought what he was doing was beautiful, and I thought what he was doing was a type of art that is fairly immortal. I mean, watching the films that he made, there's one in particular where he set up a slack line between two towers, and then when the full moon came, he was able to walk across the moon because the moon was right behind his slack line. And it was so beautiful. I mean, I'm sure you can Google it right now and find it. I mean, it's so beautiful. And, I guess I do still actually carry with me that maybe adolescent idea that like art is so important that you might have to die for it. In that essay, I talk about Keats and his foolish attempt to climb a mountain when he got tuberculosis and then died. But shit, now I'm 55 and I have a 6-year-old. I'm not gonna die for my art, but I still absolutely am inspired, and I admire those artists who took it that seriously and who were willing to do it.
Another example of this ambitions or ideas going awry with reality, which maybe is only tangentially related, but it's one that I've told a story I've told my students many times, is that of Utah's tourism campaign to promote the national parks. This is like mid 20-teens, and they want to boost tourism, and they come up with this new branding of the Mighty Five
Right.
to get more tourists to come. And sure, this sounds great. It's a boost for the local economies. Everybody wins. But then, oops, it was too successful. And now
Oops,
the
it
parks
worked.
are like, when I first moved here, we went to Zion really early when my family first moved to Utah, and we just went and did Angel's Landing, and I've been back to Zion a number of times since, and each time it has got progressively less enjoyable. And now when we did Angel's Landing, my kids were too little, and now they were big enough, and we tried to do it, and we couldn't get our names in on the lottery. And but again, the ambition, the idea of what, the Utah Tourism Agency or whoever it was thought they were doing and what they thought the outcome was going to be, unanticipated outcomes.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the advertising campaign they did was not Smokey the Bear. It was not like the square-jawed ranger or the even for that matter the like woodsman with the big backpack on. The advertisement they did was very like psychedelic, spiritual, Abbey-esque. There was like, even though it was a family with kids, there was like the spinning camera view of the Milky Way at night, and there was the like da-da, like the intensity of those landscapes and their road tripping, and it did feel like a cross between like Abbey and Terry Tempest Williams and like Everett Roos
Yeah.
out there with his donkey or his burro. And so it was a different message than you're used to in the tourism industry. The second thing, of course, is like we can't 100% say that this is what caused it. Maybe people were going to come anyway, but the timing sure lined up. As soon as they made these brilliant commercials, the parks filled up and became, the bucket list for everyone.
There seems to be like a direct inverse relationship to the degree in which people followed that advertisement. As that goes up, the ability to have the experience that campaign was advertising goes down. Right? So if it's all successful, then people are not going to have that experience.
Right.
It's kind of a little bit about what you mentioned with Abbey earlier. I'm sure this is something that Jim Stiles would have, or probably did, write about this exact dynamic.
And, you'd like, of course, the advert agencies who did this, at first, they were like, we take credit for all of this. And once the public kind of soured on it, they said, well, it wasn't all us. And I honestly don't have the issues I brought up in the story. I didn't necessarily have a problem with the state advertising. But what happened was that once it became so successful, the legislature wanted to keep funding it. And then they started levying taxes to keep this tourism advertisement campaign going. And that started to seem wrong to me, that if you go to Moab and you stay in a hotel, you have no choice but to pay this tourism tax, which then the legislature would basically seize and to give to the tourism bureau, which would then make more ads and bring more people.
You're contributing to your own demise in a way.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's not just that it's changing the or limiting the ability to have whatever that wilderness experience is, which is I think worth mourning and thinking really critically about. But the effects spill over to the local communities as well, which is something that comes out in a lot of your essays, is with tourism development and more hotels and whatnot. And like you already mentioned, like these locals now have to dirtbag it 25, 30 miles out of town. So like the people that are working, at that bookstore or at the subway in Moab, like they can't afford to live there. And so there's also, so some people might say, oh, okay, so someone can't have the spiritual wilderness experience. Wah, right? Okay, fine. But there are just normal people's lives being really severely impacted and often in very negative ways by the kinds of development as well. Another kind of and maybe it shouldn't have been an unanticipated consequence, because in previous decades we've already seen the same thing happen in Jackson and in so many other places. Even in Moab, if you're comparing Moab of the 60s to the Moab of the aughts or even the 2010s, when that advertising campaign began, we'd already seen that. But
yes, Jim Stiles did say when I first arrived in Moab in '93 that it was already ruined. The slogan on his newspaper, the Canyon Country Zephyr, was clinging hopelessly to the past since 1989. So he had foreseen all of this.
He was such a character.
Yeah. And I would just, maybe this was one of your upcoming questions, but I'll respond to it before you ask it. But as I developed as a writer and thought more deeply about the West, that moved me inevitably into thinking about indigenous tribes in Indian country, and just realizing and commenting on how much this boom in tourism is just another way of taking away things from Native people. And so I spent a lot of time up at Standing Rock during the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And that was just mind-boggling to me for many reasons, but the one I'm thinking of now is that, in Utah, the Colorado River is sort of like the martyr of industrialism, right? It's like we damned the Glen Canyon, and it was the worst crime ever against the environment. And we saved the Grand Canyon, and we saved the Green River and Dinosaur, and those were these huge victories. Meanwhile, in that same dam building era on the Missouri River, which is not scenic and recreational the way that the Colorado is, it just goes through the plains. The federal government built 7 dams on the Missouri, and they were all of them on Indian reservations because the Indians were not able to fight them as effectively as the Sierra Club, which AKA the white people. And this continues today up at Standing Rock. That pipeline was supposed to go underneath the Missouri River right above Bismarck, which is 90% white. And the good citizens of Bismarck, environmentalists and civic Democrats, came out and said, hey, we don't want an oil line above our only water supply. That would be terrible. And the pipeline company, along with the Army Corps, said, oh, okay, let's put it below Bismarck right above the Indian reservation.
And they said, okay, that's fine.
To transfer that risk of utter disaster to the Indians. And that's what they did. And there was a big fight about it, which, you can read about in Delusions and Grandeur. But seeing it through that lens of the sort of historic theft of indigenous resources from colonial people, like this tourism thing seems just one of many in that way.
Yeah.
And as I write about in the essay about St. George and the Lake Powell pipeline, which, for those of you who don't know, is a big pipeline that they were going to build that goes into the Colorado River at Lake Powell and sucks water 200 and something feet up out of the canyon, and then maybe 150 miles to St. George. Who's doing this? Is it the free market? No, it's the state of Utah. The state of Utah is raising taxes to build water infrastructure, to build communities on land that is owned by the state of Utah. So in other words, this is like a socialist development. And meanwhile, on the other side of the Colorado River is the Navajo Nation in Utah, where people still haul water in pickup trucks because they have no running water in their homes. And this feels almost like an apartheid situation where the state is prioritizing literally fake lakes where people can go paddleboarding, and golf courses down in the desert that need a gajillion gallons of water because they want to build that recreational outdoor lifestyle while other citizens of Utah are without drinking water.
So in both ways, with the Dakota Access Pipeline and with this pipeline in southern Utah, in the one case, it's like a NIMBY, like not in my backyard.
Right.
With this oil pipeline. In St. George, it's like, yes, in my backyard. We'd like the water in my backyard, but not in the Navajos, who have an ongoing water infrastructure project that they're trying to fund as well, right?
Right, which is, funded by the feds, and so therefore caught up in decades of wrangling in D.C., whereas the Lake Powell pipeline is a state-run project, and they could move more nimbly. I don't know what the latest is. This was several years ago when I wrote the story originally. I know it hasn't been built yet, but I also know it hasn't gone away.
There's a little bit of this NIMBY vibe as well in your essay about John. Is it Weishite?
Yeah,
how's
John
his name's
Weishite.
pronounced? So you take this insane road trip to DC. He's like a local environmental activist down in Moab, trying to get rid of some of the dams on the Colorado River and so forth. But you frame this essay with the cars, with this old beater that you drive out there and it ends up dying. And then in the end, you guys have to go to a car dealership and you buy a used Camry to drive back. So you frame the whole story around motorized vehicles that you are using and participating in. But the thing that John goes to do is to meet with the Park Service, in which he gets up and just gives kind of a 5-minute spiel decrying motorized vehicles in the Grand Canyon.
Right.
And then he just gets up and leaves, right? Um,
Yeah.
and so again, it's like he doesn't want certain kinds of motorized vehicles in certain places in his backyard in the Grand Canyon.
Right.
But to advocate that, he uses motorized vehicles, across the highway system.
Yeah, and this is something that was really hammered home at Standing Rock because at some points I think there was over 10,000 people living in the protest camp, and all of them had driven there from somewhere else. And it was quite easy for the opponents of this to say, "Look at these hypocrites! They're using gasoline to go protest gasoline, or for using oil to go protest oil." But I might point out that this is the result of having an economy that's completely dependent on fossil fuels, is that you can't do anything without fossil fuels, much less protest. So if you
Yeah.
have two choices. You can be a hypocrite and use oil to protest oil, or you can shut your mouth and use oil. Like,
Yeah.
it is virtually impossible to function in our society without fossil fuels. And so, like, if you want to take the fight to the companies, you're going to have to use their products to get there. I mean, where it's not realistic that people are going to bicycle from California to, or from Colorado to Standing Rock so that they can protest this oil pipeline.
Like, I'm sure someone did, but it's not practical for everyone, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But again, another example of like these ideas of these idealized concepts of who we are in the West, the relationships we have, and the reality is just a lot messier when you peel back
Yeah.
a few layers, and often very contradictory. One other theme I wanted to talk about, which was the West is kind of a place of transformation, which I guess we've already touched on in quite a few ways. You have a really interesting essay about a guy who's a Jack London impersonator, and in a way kind of using this Western figure as a way to transform himself. You talk about kind of like lounge act performers in Wendover and West Wendover, bonkers, very fascinating places. I mean, I think there should be entire books written about these two communities on the other sides of the border, but people transforming themselves there. But we don't have time to get into that. But I just wanted to ask, so as you look back at yourself, I mean, clearly the West, its landscapes, peoples, economies, everything, it's shaped your entire adult life. But as you look back at that original move from the coastal West to the interior West and various later moves around the region, can you articulate how your original or subsequent ambitions and the resulting realities you faced, have transformed you?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, like, initially I had this dream of being a writer and of being an artist. And this is before the internet was invented. So there I was living in Moab, Utah in a trailer and writing, and it seemed absolutely impossible that I would ever reach an audience with this. And I think that's why I was drawn to this Elvis impersonator in the casino, who really thought he was great, really thought he and his wife were, and I quote, "the Sonny and Cher of the millennium." And then this Jack London impersonator who worked at a hardware store in Northern California and really deeply spiritually felt that he was channeling Jack London's vision and greatness. And to the outside observer, it seemed like he could hardly get himself a kid's birthday party to perform at. And then, of course, the third one in the book is the guy that blasted the hole in the rock home down south of
Mhm.
Moa, which I'm sure many of your listeners have driven by, with the huge white painted letters on the side of this cliff. And that was built by a guy who wanted to make a monumental work of art alongside, or to be in the same category of Mount Rushmore. And he ended up instead blasting a cave, and his family turned into a tourist trap after he died. But anyway, like, that's I was drawn to those people because obviously in retrospect that's how I felt, that I had these huge delusions of what I could do as a writer, and I felt like I was out in the middle of nowhere with no one paying attention. And in the decades that passed since then, I did succeed, and I did get my books published, um, in the by the New York publishers, and I wrote for the national glossy magazines, and so I did actually find that audience. Um, but I think also just being a Western writer, like, you're always aware that people aren't really paying attention in the centers of power. I mean, famously, Ed Abbey and Wallace Stegner always talked about the lack of being taken seriously by the New York Times and the East Coast critics. So I do still feel that I'm writing work that's incredibly important, that's about America, but is being pigeonholed as like writing about the West. I would like to say I'm writing about America, but there's that. As far as personal transformation, boy, yeah, like I did grow up, and I lasted 11 years as a river guide, and then I wanted to be more committed to my writing, and then to my family, to having a wife and a child. Like, suffered an incredible tragedy. Our first child died, which I write about a little bit in this book, and that just turned my world upside down, and made me value sort of family and a little bit of stability far more than I did for my first 40 years, where I really did succeed in being a vagabond artist.
Well, for others who, and maybe we can kind of close on this, who live in the West or visit, and I guess I'm not looking for, like, quote unquote, like, moral lessons, but for people who read these essays, especially for Westerners or people visiting, like, what are you hoping they'll bring clarity to, or make us reflect on, or make us be more aware of? Like, if someone stopped you on the street and said, "Oh, hey, I read your Delusions and Grandeur book," like, what's, like, the thing that you would hope they would say, "Here's what the book did for me"?
That's a good question. I mean, I think first and foremost, I want them to be entertained and to be moved. I think a lot of these stories are, you know, they do have an emotional impact. I mean, just the story of John Whiteside, for example, uh, a Westerner who went to DC for the first time to protest the Iraq War, and like, I felt like he had such a sense of disappointment of like, this is what our country is. He said it's so gaudy. um,
Mhm.
and like, there's almost like a Huckleberry Finn kind of innocence there, which I mean, John and I are still good friends, and I appreciate him, and I love that he sticks to that. So anyway, I think all of these people who I've profiled, like, they're undergoing deeply emotional transformations, and I like that. And I think the other thing is that a lot of these environmental issues or political issues that I've written about here, they might be in the news for a couple weeks or months, and then they go away. And I just have this fear that so-called environmentalists are just talking to each other in an echo chamber. And what I would like with this book is for people who don't identify as environmentalists to be drawn in by some of these characters and some of these ideas about identity and delusion and who we are. And then maybe they would also say, like, oh, you know what? I'm actually interested in some of these ideas about connecting with the non-human world, connecting with the earth. Yeah, I'd like to bring some new people to these ideas.
I think I think you'll be effective by telling stories of people on the ground. These are the people that, like, when you go to Moab or other places, you're walking by them on the street, and you're not gonna think twice. But maybe now people will. Like,
Yeah.
these are real human stories with emotion and meaning, and they're speaking to, yeah, some of these big, broader issues. I think I'm hopeful that you'll be able to draw some people in and turn them on to thinking more critically about some of these things.
Well, thanks for having me on, and maybe so yeah, we'll reach your listeners. That's a good start.
Yeah, maybe a few extra. So when you see a few extra nickels and dimes and royalties coming in, you can that's the writing Westward bump.
Yeah.
Well, congrats on the book. I think it's especially fun if some of these are pieces you'd already put out, but now they have, a permanent home, because sometimes things in magazines, like, it's hard to find them again, and now they're
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
under one cover. So that's awesome. And I look forward to seeing your name in the news and for future, articles or books, other things that you write as well.
Thank you so much.
And I hope we'll cross paths in person someday, Mark. I'm sure we operate in some overlapping circles, so maybe there's a chance.
We do. Yeah. We always drive through Provo on our way to Moab. We have to go to IKEA to get furniture.
That's right. This has been great. Thanks so much for taking some time with us, Mark.
Thank you. Let me know when this comes out. I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you'll subscribe and listen every month. Please leave us a review on whatever app or platform you're listening through, and follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or X Twitter. On those platforms, you can get updates, leave comments, and share episodes with your friends, family, and colleagues. Writing Westward is supported by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. We are an interdisciplinary research center that supports academic research and the promotion of public understanding of the North American West. We host regular public lectures, which we live stream on our YouTube and Facebook pages, have an annual funding cycle with awards, grants, and fellowship categories that nearly anyone can apply for if they are researching or working on the region from any disciplinary approach or towards any final product. Learn more at Redd Center, that's REDD Center.byu.edu. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. His website is also linked in the show notes. As the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, publicist, and everything else, you can direct any praise or critique my way. I'm the author and editor of a number of books, articles, and chapters on the North American West, borderlands, Native peoples, genocide studies, religion, and the environment. My recent books include a 2018 volume, Native Foreign, Indigenous Immigrants and Refugees in the North American Borderlands, which won the Best Historical Nonfiction Book Award from the Western Writers of America. A 2019 anthology I co-edited with P. Jane Hafen, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, which won the Metcalf Best Anthology Book Prize from the John Whitmer Historical Association, and a 2022 collection of essays I edited entitled The North American West in the 21st Century. I also recently launched and will be editing a new series for the University of New Mexico Press entitled The West in Context. Send me a note if you have a manuscript to propose for publication. Here at the Redd Center, I'm also the general editor and project manager of a great digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. It's a free mobile app and website, intermountainhistories.org, that curates student-researched and written microhistories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. To contact me about the podcast, my own research, or anything else, head to bwrensink.org, email me at bwrensink@byu.edu, or follow me on Blue Sky or X Twitter at Brendan W. Rensink. Until next month, be well, be curious, be kind. Cheers.